why is Washington so invested in Myanmar, and could this reduce China's influence in the region? Joining me now to talk about this is Jia Xiudong. He is a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, a Beijing-based think tank. And with me here in the studio is Christina Fink. She's a professor of international affairs at George Washington University. She is also the author of the book, Living Silence in Burma, Surviving Under Military Rule. And I want to welcome both of you to the show. Let's talk about the political reforms and the impact of this. And why don't I start with you, Mr. Jia? Do you think that this is going to have an impact on the relationship between Myanmar and China, this sort of pivot towards the U.S.?
Well, the impact is mixed. Actually, China would like to see positive changes in Myanmar. Actually, China also urged the U.S. and Myanmar to improve their relations in the past. So China's policy is that it does not interfere in the internal affairs of Myanmar and other countries. So the changes taking place in Myanmar will not mean that China's influence will be waning in that country. Actually, both sides have reaffirmed their commitment to developing relations between the two sides.
Christina, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree that China would benefit from a more economically prosperous and stable Myanmar. But I think it's also the case that China is going to have to recalibrate its relationship with the country, because now Myanmar has other countries that it can turn to in times of need. And China has been in a position in the past where really it could dictate to Myanmar, and that's no longer the case.
Well, trade with China grew by 46% in 2012. So obviously it's still a partnership arrangement. But does this, I guess the question is, as they move closer to the United States, does that create a distance naturally? I mean, is it just a natural thing that's going to happen?
Well, I think, China is a huge neighbor, and there's no way that Myanmar would not have a very close and deep relationship with China. But what will happen is that Chinese companies are going to be called on to be more responsive to citizens in Myanmar, because in the past they've been able to conduct projects without really having to think about the impact on citizens, including hydropower dams, resource extraction, gas pipelines, and there's a lot of resentment in Myanmar about these.
Well, I want to touch on that, but Mr. Jia, does it change the complexion of things when, at one point you're the only game in town and then suddenly it changes?
Well, actually both sides, both China and Myanmar, have been adapting to the new reality in that country. Actually, when we look around the world, China is doing well in both developed countries, also like Myanmar and many other countries. So the changes there doesn't mean that China's business will not enjoy the advantages they have enjoyed in the past. So they are just adapting to a new reality there.
Well, let me ask you, though, Mo, if I can follow up. She brings up an interesting point about the resentment against China, and there's been this suspension of the Chinese-backed hydroelectric project, the copper mine, which you've alluded to. I guess the question has to be, why has this happened, and what's the reaction there in Beijing?
Well, with the Milson hydropower project, I think President Woo Sen would like to show its people that he cares about the livelihood there, the environment there. Actually, he was trying to win political support domestically, and also he would like to show to the international community that he's a different leader than the past ones. Actually, for China, this kind of change in the project is just one of the episodes in the relationship, and will not have a long-term negative impact on bilateral relations. And so actually the two governments let the businesses, the enterprises to deal with this kind of a specific case.
Well, why don't you touch more on this? Because this really has been kind of a lightning rod, these two projects I talked about. And you mentioned it, the people in the country themselves are kind of, there's been a bit of an uproar, hasn't there?
Right. I mean, these deals were originally negotiated between a military regime and Chinese companies, state-owned companies. And at that time, citizens couldn't say anything. But now that the government has changed and there's an opportunity for citizens to speak out freely, they're saying we're not going to put up with these kinds of projects. So it's really incumbent on Chinese companies to work more with the citizens in the areas where they'd like to carry out projects and really look at the environmental impact and social impact of those projects before they begin.
Do you see more of a pivot from the United States to Myanmar in the future, Mr. Jia?
Actually, the United States has paid much more attention to Myanmar. Myanmar is one of the key areas the United States would like to invest more politically, economically, militarily in the future with its rebalancing towards Southeast Asia. However, the relationship between China and Myanmar remains strong. So it's not kind of a zero-sum game with these latest developments there. So for Myanmar, actually, it doesn't have to be a kind of one or the other kind of choice.
Well, how about the fighting between the army and the ethnic Chinese rebels that are there in northern Myanmar? How's that being viewed in China?
Well, China certainly would like to see peace and stability along its borders. And that's why China has urged both the Myanmar government and the ethnic groups to come back to the table and work for ethnic national reconciliation. Actually, it has succeeded to bring them to China, to Kunming, to Yunnan province for talks. And so China would like to see reduced tensions there so that all the sides, the central government of Myanmar, the ethnic groups in China, you can cooperate on economic development in the area.
Your husband is from the country. You've written about it. How do you see that conflict there?
Well, it's urgent that that conflict be resolved because the conflict in Burma began with ethnic conflict. Right after independence in 1949, the conflict began and has continued until today. And foreign investment is not going to really expand in the country until there's peace in all parts of the country.
What about military intentions on the part of the United States? Are there any designs in that regard, would you say?
Well, certainly the United States wants to increase its military ties with all the countries in Southeast Asia, and they're concerned about the growing strength of the Chinese military and the Chinese Navy. Another concern is North Korea, because North Korea has had close military relations with Myanmar, and in the past was selling weapons to the Myanmar army.
Mr. Jia, how would that be viewed there in Beijing if that were to occur?
Certainly, with the U.S. rebalancing towards Southeast Asia, we'd like to see a less, focus on the military side of its policy. It should focus more on economic trade sides and actual cooperation in the region. So many scholars here in Beijing, in China, think that the United States should not try to drive kind of wedge, so to speak, between China and Myanmar. Of course, that will increase distrust between China and the U.S., and it's not conducive to the bilateral relations. It's not good, actually, for Myanmar. I think Myanmar understands that, and it doesn't. So Myanmar will not develop the relations with the United States at the expense of its relation with China.
Christina, I see you shaking your head. It is a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
It is a very delicate balancing act, but I think that the Myanmar army in the past was disappointed in some cases with the weapons that they received from the Chinese military, and they're looking for other sources, including the United States.
Let me ask one final question of both of you, which is, sustained foreign investment in that country. I've seen experts who are actually flooding the zone, so to speak, sending people to Myanmar because they see it as a great potential. But they say that what the legacy of the last 50 years is, and I want to get both of you to talk about this, is the infrastructure. They say it's disastrous. Briefly, yes. How big an issue is that? Christina, I'll start with you, and then Mr. Jia, if you could follow up.
Well, it's a huge issue. The roads are terrible, the internet is terrible, limited electricity. So there are huge barriers that need to be overcome before foreign investment can really spread in the country.
Mr. Jia, you get the final word on this. Your thoughts?
Yes, I visited Myanmar 21 years ago twice, and I plan to visit Myanmar early this year, but I didn't go from other countries in the South Asia because of the really I couldn't. It's not easy to travel to the new capital in Myanmar, so the infrastructure is still poor, and there is huge opportunity for all the countries to cooperate, including the United States, India, Japan, and other countries.
All right. Thank you both for joining us here on The Heat. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.